Look at this map. In just 6 days in 1967, the entire landscape of the Middle East was completely rewritten in a flash of fire. Hundreds of combat jets from 3 different nations were completely wiped out before they even had a chance to lift off the runway. Welcome to the 6-Day War, a brutal masterclass in preemptive military tactics, and arguably the most decisive blitzkrieg of the modern era. To understand how this happened, we have to rewind to May 1967. The Middle East was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Israel found itself geographically surrounded by hostile neighbors, Egypt to the south, Syria to the north, and Jordan firmly positioned to the east. Tensions had been steadily rising for years over water rights, border skirmishes, and a deeply rooted geopolitical rivalry that refused to cool down. The boiling point arrived when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser made a massive, highly provocative military move that shocked the international community. Nasser ordered the United Nations Emergency Force, which had kept the peace in the Sinai Peninsula for over a decade, to pack up and leave immediately. With the UN peacekeepers gone, the Egyptian military quickly flooded into the Sinai, amassing thousands of troops and heavy armor right on Israel's border. But Nasser didn't stop there. He played his most dangerous card, ordering a naval blockade of the strategically vital Strait of Tiran. This narrow waterway was Israel's only gateway to the Red Sea, and closing it cut off 90% of the vital oil supply. For the Israeli government, this wasn't just a political dispute anymore. Under international law, blockading a vital strait was considered a direct act of war. In Tel Aviv, military leaders like Defense Minister Moshe Dayan faced a terrifying reality. An Arab coalition was actively preparing for a massive invasion. Waiting to be attacked would mean absolute annihilation for the small nation. Their only chance of survival was a desperate, incredibly risky gamble. If they couldn't win a prolonged defensive war, they had to strike first, strike hard, and completely blind their enemies before the first shot was fired. But launching a preemptive strike against 3 combined national armies required more than just bravery. It required an obsessive level of intelligence gathering. For years, the Israeli intelligence agency, Mossad, had been meticulously mapping out every single Arab military installation, focusing heavily on Egyptian air bases. They didn't just know where the bases were. They knew the exact daily schedules of the Egyptian pilots and commanders, down to the very minute. They discovered a critical window at 7:45 a.m. The morning patrols returned to base, and the commanders went to the dining hall for breakfast. To ensure maximum surprise, Israel engaged in brilliant deception. Over the weekend prior, they deliberately sent thousands of frontline troops on beach leave. Egyptian spies reported this back to Cairo. President Nasser and his generals relaxed, believing an imminent Israeli attack was completely off the table. But behind closed doors, the Israeli Air Force was drilling with frantic intensity, focusing obsessively on a revolutionary concept: turnaround time. Normally, after a combat jet lands, it takes the ground crew about 2 hours to refuel, rearm, and fully inspect the aircraft for the next flight. Through relentless, grueling practice, Israeli ground crews achieved the impossible. They reduced their turnaround time from 2 hours down to an astonishing 8 minutes. This mathematical miracle effectively tripled the size of the Israeli Air Force, allowing one jet to fly 3 sorties in the time it took the enemy to fly 1. The plan, codenamed Operation Focus, was simple but brutally effective. Don't fight the enemy jets in the sky. Destroy the runways, and trap them on the ground. To achieve this, they developed a specialized concrete-piercing, dibber, bomb, equipped with braking parachutes and rockets, designed to crater the runways perfectly. By the night of June 4th, an eerie, terrifying silence fell over the region. The entire Israeli military went into absolute, total radio silence. Pilots slept on simple field cots right underneath the wings of their fully fueled Mirage and Mystère fighter jets, waiting anxiously for the dawn. At exactly 7 a.m. on June 5th, Defense Minister Dayan gave the green light. The waiting was over. The boldest air assault in history had begun. Almost 200 Israeli combat jets roared down the runways, taking to the skies in a massive, perfectly synchronized swarm of metal. It was an all-in gamble. They sent nearly their entire air force, leaving a mere 12 fighter jets behind to defend their entire nation. Instead of taking the direct, expected route south over the desert, the massive strike force headed west, flying out over the Mediterranean Sea. to evade the extensive Soviet-supplied radar networks. The highly trained pilots flew incredibly low, sometimes just 15 meters above the crashing ocean waves. Egyptian radar operators stared at empty screens. The sweeping radar waves simply passed right over the top of the incoming armada. Seeing absolutely nothing, total radio silence was enforced. Even if a plane experienced catastrophic mechanical failure, the pilot was strictly forbidden to transmit a distress call. Once far out to sea and completely undetected, the armada made a sharp, coordinated turn to the south, heading directly for the Egyptian mainland. Back in Cairo, the morning routine continued peacefully. Commanders were finishing their breakfast, completely oblivious to the impending mechanical doom flying towards them. But there was a terrifying glitch in the plan. A powerful Jordanian radar facility at Ajlan unexpectedly managed to pick up the massive formation. The panicked Jordanian operators frantically transmitted a top-secret red alert codeword, Inab, meaning war, directly to the Egyptian High Command in Cairo. But in a twist of unbelievable historical irony, the Egyptian military had updated their encryption codes the very day before. Without telling everyone, the vital warning arrived in Cairo, but absolutely no one could decipher it. The message that could have saved the Egyptian Air Force was just meaningless static. At exactly 7:45 a.m., just as the Egyptian morning patrols landed and parked perfectly in rows, the Israeli jets roared fiercely over the horizon. The element of surprise was absolute. Looking down through their targeting visors, the Israeli pilots saw hundreds of enemy aircraft sitting like defenseless ducks. With clinical precision, the order was given. The first wave of concrete-piercing Dibber bombs detached from the wings, hurtling toward the runways below. The specialized Dibber bombs penetrated deep beneath the concrete before detonating, creating massive, jagged craters and rendering the runways completely useless. Hundreds of advanced Egyptian fighter jets were instantly trapped on the ground, effectively turned into multi-million-dollar paperweights in a matter of seconds. With the runways destroyed, successive waves of Israeli aircraft swooped in, systematically dismantling the stranded planes with pinpoint cannon fire. In Cairo, the unimaginable reality set in. In less than a few hours, the largest and most powerful air force in the Middle East had simply ceased to exist. But the operation wasn't over. The first wave of Israeli pilots raced back to their home bases to execute their secret weapon in real time. This is where the obsessive training paid off. The exact moment a jet's wheels touched the tarmac, the ground crew swarmed it like a Formula One pit stop. In just 8 frantic minutes, the aircraft was completely refueled, rearmed with fresh bombs, mechanically checked, and thrust back into the sky for a second wave. This impossible turnaround speed completely shattered the enemy's calculations. For the Arab commanders, it seemed as if Israel suddenly possessed 3 times as many planes. While Egypt burned, the fog of war took over. False reports reached Syria and Jordan claiming a massive Arab victory, prompting them to launch their own airstrikes. They believed the entire Israeli Air Force was still bogged down, completely exhausted in the south over Egypt. They were catastrophically wrong. Thanks to the relentless 8-minute turnaround, Israeli jets were already refueled, back in the air, and pivoting north and east with terrifying speed. By the early afternoon, the Syrian and Jordanian air forces met the exact same devastating fate as Egypt, wiped out before they could make a dent. When the sun finally set on June 5th, the numbers were staggering. Over 400 Arab aircraft were completely destroyed across multiple airbases. Israel lost just 19 planes. In a single, flawlessly executed day, they had secured absolute, uncontested control of the skies across the entire Middle East. With the enemy completely blinded and stripped of all air support, Defense Minister Dayan gave the order to unleash the armored Blitzkrieg on the ground. 3 massive Israeli armored divisions, totaling nearly 300 tanks, surged across the southern border directly into the harsh, unforgiving Sinai Peninsula. The ground trembled as thousands of tons of steel rolled forward. But this wasn't a slow, methodical advance. It was a high-speed desert blitzkrieg. Israeli commanders understood that in the vast, open desert, mobility was the greatest weapon. Whoever moved faster dictated the entire flow of battle. They pushed their modified tanks to the absolute mechanical limit, prioritizing relentless forward momentum over establishing traditional, slow-moving supply lines. Waiting for them were heavily fortified Egyptian defensive networks, deep trenches, massive minefields, and artillery batteries designed to grind any frontal assault to a bloody halt. But the Israelis rarely attacked head-on. Instead, they utilized deep, sweeping flanking maneuvers. Driving right through treacherous sand dunes the Egyptians thought were impassable. By bypassing the strongest defenses and attacking from the rear, they completely shattered the enemy's front line, causing widespread panic and paralyzing the command structure. Back in Cairo, the situation devolved into absolute chaos. Field commanders were sending wildly conflicting reports, or simply not reporting at all. As communication networks collapsed completely, the Egyptian high command panicked. They issued a disastrous, uncoordinated order for a general retreat across the entire Sinai. This turned an organized defense into a desperate race for survival, but the highly mobile Israeli armored columns were already waiting for them at critical choke points. To make matters infinitely worse for the retreating forces, the Israeli Air Force, now completely free from any enemy threats, rained absolute devastation from the skies. Without any anti-air defenses or fighter escorts, the exposed Egyptian convoys were trapped in the open desert, becoming sitting ducks for the relentless airstrikes. The gruesome climax of this desert nightmare occurred at the Mitla Pass, a narrow, treacherous mountain gorge that offered the only escape route back to Egypt. The pass became a terrifying bottleneck. Hundreds of vehicles were jammed together and subsequently destroyed, creating a literal mountain of burning, twisted metal. In just 3 days, the entire Sinai Peninsula was captured. But even as the southern front collapsed, a new, equally brutal war was erupting in the east. Despite Israel sending secret, urgent diplomatic messages urging Jordan to stay out of the conflict, King Hussein was under massive political pressure from the Arab world. Desperate, President Nasser of Egypt explicitly lied to the Jordanian king over the phone, falsely claiming that Egyptian forces were currently crushing the Israeli military. Believing these entirely fabricated reports, Jordanian artillery batteries immediately opened fire, indiscriminately bombarding the civilian streets and neighborhoods of West Jerusalem. This was exactly the nightmare scenario Israel had desperately tried to avoid, fighting a bloody, resource-draining, multi-front war at the exact same time. But with the Egyptian front collapsing faster than anyone predicted, elite Israeli paratroopers were rapidly redeployed from the desert to the claustrophobic streets of Jerusalem. Urban warfare is historically a meat grinder. To protect the deeply sacred holy sites of the Old City, Israel strictly forbade the use of heavy artillery. This meant fighting brutal, hand-to-hand combat. But on June 7, they broke through, reaching the Western Wall for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Within just 48 hours, the Jordanian military was completely shattered and pushed back across the river. The entire West Bank now fell under Israeli control. 2 fronts down, 1 to go. Up in the north, the Syrian army had been relentlessly shelling Israeli farming settlements from a massive geological fortress. This was the dreaded Golan Heights, a towering, near-vertical plateau rising hundreds of meters into the sky, heavily fortified with deep Soviet-designed bunker networks. Attacking a heavily entrenched enemy who holds the high ground is a military nightmare. Traditional doctrine states the attacking force needs a 3-to-1 numerical advantage. Because of this, Defense Minister Dayan was initially extremely hesitant to order an assault, fearing absolutely catastrophic casualties and a potential military intervention from the Soviet Union. However, to permanently stop the shelling, the order was given. Israeli armored bulldozers and tanks began a brutally slow, grinding ascent up the near-vertical slopes under heavy fire. Once again, their absolute, uncontested air supremacy proved to be the deciding factor. Israeli jets mercilessly pounded the Syrian cliff-top bunkers, clearing a bloody path for the armor. By the 5th day of the war, the armor finally breached the summit. The Syrian defensive lines completely collapsed, and the strategic plateau was taken. While the guns blazed in the Middle East, the United Nations in New York was in a state of absolute, unprecedented diplomatic panic. The military situation on the ground was changing so unbelievably fast that diplomats couldn't even draft a ceasefire resolution before the map was redrawn again. Finally, by June 10, the Arab coalition had completely collapsed. A UN-brokered ceasefire was implemented, silencing the guns after exactly 132 hours of combat. The political fallout was instantaneous. In Cairo, a visibly broken President Nasser went on national television to take full responsibility and officially resign. However, in a bizarre twist, Massive public demonstrations flooded the streets demanding he stay, forcing him to retract his resignation the very next day. But the physical damage was permanently done. The Arab coalition suffered over 20,000 casualties and lost billions of dollars in military hardware. In stark contrast, Israel had lost fewer than 1,000 soldiers. And geographically, the tiny nation had just tripled its landmass in less than a week. They now completely controlled the massive Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the highly strategic Golan Heights. The shockwaves hit Moscow hard. The Soviet Union watched in absolute horror as their heavily funded proxy armies and top-tier weapons were completely dismantled. Meanwhile, the United States took careful notes. The Six-Day War firmly cemented the Middle East as a highly volatile, high-stakes chessboard in the global Cold War. But the redrawn map came with a devastating human cost. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and Syrians fled their homes, becoming refugees overnight. The stunning military victory didn't solve the deep-rooted geopolitical hatred. Instead, it twisted the regional conflict into an even more complex, unsolvable knot. Yet, from a purely tactical standpoint, the campaign became legendary. Military academies worldwide immediately began studying Operation Focus and the armored Blitzkrieg. It proved definitively that in modern warfare, absolute speed, perfect intelligence, and total air supremacy could completely crush numerical superiority in a matter of days. But as Israeli leaders stared at their massive new borders, a chilling realization set in. Winning the war was quick, but managing the peace would prove impossible. To govern these newly occupied territories meant ruling over 1 million deeply hostile inhabitants. The stunning tactical masterpiece had accidentally planted the seeds for decades of endless insurgency. Any hopes for a quick land for peace treaty were completely shattered 2 months later in Khartoum, when Arab leaders famously issued the definitive 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and absolutely no negotiations. The 132-hour war was officially over. But the forever war had just truly begun. But if we separate the politics from the battlefield, the Six-Day War remains to this day one of the most studied military campaigns in human history. It fundamentally rewrote the rulebook on air power. Operation Focus proved that whoever fully controls the sky absolutely dictates the survival of forces on the ground. It demonstrated that raw military numbers mean nothing without flawless intelligence gathering and extreme logistical efficiency. Like the miraculous 8-minute turnaround time. And perhaps most importantly, it showed the devastating effectiveness of the preemptive strike, destroying the enemy's capacity to fight before they even cross the border. However, this overwhelming success created a dangerous psychological trap. Israeli high command developed a fatal sense of invincibility, believing Arab armies could never challenge them again. This dangerous overconfidence blinded them to the reality that their enemies were learning, adapting, and secretly rearming with newer, deadlier Soviet technology. Just 6 years later, this arrogance would cost them dearly. In 1973, a reorganized Arab coalition would launch their own devastating surprise attack, the Yom Kippur War. It proves the oldest, most tragic paradox of military history. You can execute a flawless, textbook campaign, achieve every single tactical objective, and still fail to secure long-term stability. The map of the Middle East we see on the news today was permanently forged in the fires of 1967. It remains a haunting reminder that while weapons and tactics evolve at lightning speed, the bitter, deep-rooted animosities of nations take generations to heal. The Six-Day War stands as a brilliant masterclass in preemptive military tactics, but also as a grim warning about the illusion of an easy victory. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how the Yom Kippur War completely flipped this script 6 years later, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments below.